The afternoon sun hung over the plains east of Adrianople, and the air shimmered with a heat that made the horizon ripple like water. A Roman army of tens of thousands stood baking in their armor, throats dry, eyes fixed on a ring of wagons crowning the low hills ahead. Inside that ring waited the Goths, and somewhere beyond the dust and the trampled grass, a sound began to grow. It was not a war cry. It was a low rolling thunder, the drumming of hooves on hard summer ground, rising from a direction no Roman commander had thought to watch. By the time anyone understood what it was already too late. What rode out of that haze would shatter the most disciplined fighting force the ancient world had ever produced. By nightfall, an emperor would be dead, his body lost forever, and 2/3 of an imperial army would lie heaped across a few square miles of Thracian soil. Historians would later mark this single afternoon as the day the long unraveling of Rome began. And the strangest part of the whole catastrophe is this. The weapon that broke Rome had been sitting just out of sight the entire time, and the Romans never even knew it was there. This is the story of the Battle of Adrianople, fought on the 9th of August in the year 378, and the hidden force that turned a routine police action into one of the worst military disasters in the history of the empire. To make sense of how it happened, we have to travel back 2 years to a riverbank far to the north, where a desperate crowd of refugees pressed against the edge of the Roman world and begged to be let in. The Goths were not strangers to Rome. For generations, these Germanic peoples had lived along the lower Danube, sometimes raiding the frontier provinces, sometimes trading with them, occasionally serving in the Roman armies as auxiliaries. They were divided into groups, the most important being the Tervingi and the Gruthungi, each with their own chieftains and their own territory. They were farmers and warriors and herders, and for the most part, the great river that the Romans called the Danube marked the boundary between their world and the empire. That arrangement had held, in one form or another, for a very long time. Then something came out of the east that none of them had ever faced before. The Huns, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, swept westward in the early 370s, with a speed and ferocity that left whole nations in panic. They were horsemen of a kind the settled peoples of Europe had not encountered. Fast, mobile, devastating with the bow, and seemingly endless in number. The Gruthungi were overrun. Their aging king died, by some accounts taking his own life when he saw that resistance was hopeless. The Tervingi tried to hold a defensive line and failed. And so, in the year 376, the Goths made a decision that would change the course of European history. Rather than be destroyed by the Huns, they would throw themselves on the mercy of Rome. Tens of thousands of them, perhaps far more when you count the women, children, and elderly, gathered on the northern bank of the Danube. Their leaders, the Tervingian chieftains Fritigan and Alavivus, sent envoys across the water to the Roman authorities with a request that was part plea and part bargain. Let us cross. Give us land to farm inside the empire. In return, our young men will serve in your armies, and our people will become loyal subjects who pay your taxes. It was not an unreasonable offer, and it was not unprecedented. Rome had absorbed barbarian groups before and turned them into soldiers and settlers. The decision sat with Valens, the emperor who ruled the eastern half of the Roman world from Constantinople. Valens was away in the east at the time, dealing with tensions along the Persian frontier, and the news of the Goths at the Danube reached him there. He weighed it carefully, or at least he thought he did. To him, the offer looked like a gift. Here were thousands of able-bodied men who could be enrolled into his legions, swelling his ranks for the wars he expected to fight against Persia. Here was a fresh source of military manpower and tax revenue, delivered to his border for free. Valens gave his approval. The Tervingi under Fritigan would be allowed to cross. Other groups, including the Gruthungi, were told to wait, their request denied for the moment. So the crossing began. The Romans ferried the Goths over the Danube on boats, on rafts, on hollowed-out tree trunks, anything that would float. The river was swollen with rain and ran fast and cold, and the operation went on for days. Ancient writers recorded that some of the boats capsized in the current and that people drowned trying to reach the southern shore. No one could count the multitude with any accuracy. It was simply a sea of humanity pouring into Roman territory, far more than the local officials had prepared for. And right there, at the very moment of crossing, the seeds of disaster were planted, not by the Goths, but by the men Rome had put in charge of receiving them. The Roman commander in the region was a man named Lupicinus, the Count of Thrace, and serving alongside him was an officer named Maximus. These two were supposed to oversee the settlement of the Goths, to feed them, to guide them to the lands set aside for them, and to manage the orderly disarmament and integration of a frightened, hungry people. Instead, they saw an opportunity to enrich themselves, and what they did next is one of the ugliest episodes in the late Roman record. The Goths arrived hungry, and they grew hungrier. The promised provisions either never came in sufficient quantity or were deliberately withheld. A famine gripped the region, and Lupicinus and Maximus, rather than relieving the suffering, decided to profit from it. They forced the starving Goths to buy food at outrageous prices. When the Goths ran out of money, the Roman officials accepted their possessions, and then their freedom. The ancient accounts describe a trade so cruel it is hard to read even now. The Romans sold the desperate Goths the meat of dogs, and the price they demanded for a single dog was a Gothic child, to be handed over and sold into slavery. Families gave up their sons and daughters to keep the rest from starving. Some Goths even sold themselves into bondage. Roman officers took Gothic women as concubines. People who had crossed the river as refugees seeking protection found themselves being stripped of everything, including their own children, by the very empire that had promised them sanctuary. You cannot treat a proud and armed people this way and expect it to end quietly. Resentment hardened into rage. And here Lupicinus made his first great military blunder, although it would not be his last. Sensing that the Tervingi were becoming dangerous, he decided to move them south, away from the river, toward his regional headquarters at a town called Adrianople. To escort this march, he pulled Roman troops away from their posts along the Danube. With the riverbank now unguarded, the Gothic, who had been told to wait, simply crossed over on their own. A second great body of Goths was now inside the empire, uninvited and unwatched. The Tervingi, learning of this, deliberately slowed their own march south to give their kinsmen time to catch up. The Romans had, through sheer mismanagement, allowed two hostile nations to combine on imperial soil. What happened at Adrianople lit the fuse. Lupicinus invited Fritigern and Alavivus, along with a small group of their attendants, to a grand banquet inside the city walls. The bulk of the Gothic people remained camped outside, with Roman soldiers stationed between them and the town. On the surface, it was a diplomatic dinner, a chance to discuss provisions and settle grievances. In reality, it appears to have been a trap. While the chieftains feasted, trouble flared outside the walls. The hungry Goths in the camp wanted to buy food in the town market. The Roman soldiers refused to let them, and fighting broke out. Several Roman soldiers were killed. When news of the brawl reached Lupicinus at his table, drowsy and full from a long, luxurious meal, he panicked and reacted with treachery. He ordered the attendants of the Gothic leaders, the honor guard waiting outside the hall, to be put to death. He seized the chieftains themselves. Alavivus vanishes from the historical record at this point, his fate unknown. But Fritigern, quick-witted and cool under pressure, talked his way out. He warned Lupicinus that if word of the killings reached the Gothic camp, the whole multitude would rise in fury, and that the only way to calm them was to let Fritigern go out and show his people that he was alive and that all was well. The indecisive Lupicinus, perhaps already regretting the chaos he had started, agreed and released him. It was the last mistake he would get to make cheaply. Fritigern rode out, rejoined his people, and made his choice. There would be no more starving, no more selling of children, no more humiliation at the hands of corrupt officials. The treaty with Rome was finished. The Goths would take what they needed by force, and they would make war on the empire that had betrayed them. The Gothic war horns sounded across the countryside, and the Tervingi spread out to loot and burn the Roman farms and estates around Adrianople. Lupicinus scrambled to respond. It is genuinely fascinating to see how far this story reaches across the world, and these old battles tend to draw people from places you would never expect. By the spring of the year 378, the situation had become a true crisis, and it landed squarely on the shoulders of the Emperor Valens. He had been campaigning in the east, near Antioch, watching the Persian frontier. Now he hurried to make peace with Persia so he could free his hands, and he returned to his capital at Constantinople to deal with the Goths personally. He was not a young man. He was around 50 years old, an experienced ruler, careful by temperament, not reckless. And he did not intend to face the Goths alone. He sent word to the western half of the empire, to his nephew Gratian, who ruled the west, asking him to bring his army east, so that the two imperial forces could combine and overwhelm the rebels together. Gratian agreed and began the long march east. He had reason to feel confident because he had just won a striking victory of his own. A Germanic people called the Alemanni had tried to take advantage of Rome's distraction by invading across the Rhine, and Gratian had turned, met them, and crushed them. Now, flush with success and leading a battle-hardened army, he was coming to help his uncle finish the Goths. The plan was sound. Two Roman armies, eastern and western, joining forces against a barbarian enemy that, however dangerous, was still outnumbered and burdened with families and wagons. An eventual Roman victory looked all but certain. All Valens had to do was wait. And that single word, wait, is where the whole tragedy turns. Valens advanced from Constantinople with his eastern army and made camp near the city of Adrianople, in what is now the European corner of Turkey, near the modern city of Edirne. He built a fortified position, protected by a rampart and a ditch, a strong defensive base from which to await his nephew's arrival. Messengers passed between the two emperors. Gratian sent word urging his uncle to hold on, not to do anything rash, to wait for the Western army so they could strike together. The cautious, sensible course was obvious. Sit tight behind the fortifications, let the Goths exhaust themselves, and wait for the reinforcements that were already on the road. But something had begun to gnaw at Valens, and it was the most human and the most dangerous of motives. He was jealous. His young nephew Gratian had just won a brilliant victory over the Alemanni and was being celebrated across the empire for it. Valens, the senior emperor, the older man, found himself in the humiliating position of needing to be rescued by his junior partner. The thought of sharing the glory, of having Gratian arrive to bail him out, of the credit for defeating the Goths going to the popular young hero of the West, was more than his pride could bear. Valens wanted the victory for himself, and he wanted it now, before Gratian could arrive to claim a share. Into this brittle state of mind came a piece of intelligence that seemed to make caution unnecessary. Valens held a council of war. His scouts had located Fritigann's Goths a short distance away, perhaps 15 miles from Adrianople, encamped in their ring of wagons. And the scouts reported a number. The Gothic force, they said, was only around 10,000 men. To Valens, this was decisive. His own army was far larger, by most estimates somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 strong, professional Roman soldiers against a mob of perhaps 10,000 barbarians. With odds like that, why on earth would he wait and share the laurels with his nephew? He could crush these Goths himself and have the whole triumph to his name. The scouts were wrong, and the error was the most catastrophic miscalculation of the entire war. The figure of 10,000 referred only to the warriors Fritigern had with him in the wagon camp. It left out the most important element on the field. The Gothic cavalry, the heavy horsemen of the Grey Thungi under Alatheus and Saphrax, reinforced by the Alans, were not in the camp at all. They were away from the main body, out foraging and raiding across the surrounding country, gathering supplies for the host. They were beyond the range of the Roman scouts, and so the Romans simply did not see them and did not count them. In Valens's mind, he was marching against 10,000 infantry. In reality, a powerful force of mounted warriors was loose somewhere in the landscape, unaccounted for, capable of returning to the battlefield at any moment. This was the secret weapon. Not a new invention, not a piece of clever technology, but a force of nature that the Roman command had completely failed to factor into its plans, hidden in plain sight by nothing more than distance and bad reconnaissance. There is a final, almost painful detail. Fritigern, the Gothic leader, was a far better reader of the situation than Valens. He knew his danger. He knew that if both Roman armies combined, his people might be doomed. And he knew his cavalry was away and that he needed time to bring it back. So as the crisis approached, he played for time with the oldest tool in the diplomatic kit. He sent envoys to Valens proposing peace, offering negotiations, dangling the possibility of a settlement. He was buying hours. Every hour that the Romans spent in talks was an hour closer to the return of his horsemen. Valens, caught between the temptation of a bloodless settlement and the temptation of a glorious victory, hesitated and let the talks drag, never realizing that the delay he tolerated was exactly the delay his enemy needed. On the morning of the 9th of August, in the year 378, Valens made his decision. He left a guard on his treasure and baggage at Adrianople, and he led his army out to destroy the Goths. It was a brutally hot day, the kind of dry, baking heat that the Thracian summer can produce, and the Roman soldiers marched out under it in full equipment. The route to the Gothic camp was rough and broken, and the distance was greater than expected, around 8 miles over difficult ground. By the time the long Roman column came in sight of the enemy, the men were exhausted. They had been marching for hours in armor under a merciless sun, and they had not eaten or properly rested. Their throats were parched. They were, in every physical sense, in the worst possible condition to fight a battle, and the battle had not even begun. There ahead of them, on the high ground, was the Gothic stronghold. It was not a fortress of stone, but something the Goths carried with them everywhere they went. A great circle of their wagons drawn up into a defensive ring, what was sometimes called a wagon fort. Inside it were the warriors, the families, the supplies, the whole movable nation. From a distance, the Romans could see the Goths arrayed for defense, and they could hear the noise of the camp, the shouting and the singing meant to unnerve them. And then the Goths added another torment. They set fire to the dry grass and brush across the plain between the two armies. The flames and the smoke rolled toward the Roman line, and the heat of the fires layered on top of the heat of the day, so that the exhausted, thirsty soldiers were now choking and sweltering in a haze of smoke. It was a deliberate piece of psychological and physical warfare. Wear down the enemy. Make them suffer. And above all, keep stalling. For Fritigern was still playing for time. As the Roman army formed up, hot and miserable, the Gothic leader once again opened negotiations. He sent out a request for a parley, proposing an exchange of hostages and a discussion of terms. There was confusion and delay over who should be sent and how the talks should proceed. Valens, perhaps still hoping for a settlement that would hand him a bloodless win, allowed the back and forth to continue. And all the while, somewhere out across the burning plain, the dust of returning cavalry was beginning to rise. Fritigern's gamble was paying off to the second. The hostage exchange and the parley dragged the afternoon onward, and the Roman army stood in its ranks, baking and waiting, with no idea that the clock was running down on its own destruction. The spark that set off the explosion came not from Valens, and not from Fritigern, but from the impatience of the Roman troops themselves. While the negotiations were still being arranged, 2 units on the Roman right, elite formations of mounted men, broke discipline. Whether through eagerness, confusion, or a misread order, they launched themselves at the enemy without waiting for the command to attack. It was a fatal breach of control. The carefully arranged truce dissolved in an instant. The premature charge faltered and fell back, and now the rest of the Roman line had to commit, but it did so raggedly, piecemeal, with units coming forward unevenly because the battle had begun before anyone was ready. The Roman infantry pressed up the slope toward the wagon ring, and for a time they pushed hard against the Gothic defenders, fighting their way close to the wagons. Had the battle stayed an infantry fight, the weight and discipline of the Roman foot might still have carried the day. But the battle was not going to stay an infantry fight, because at that exact moment, the secret weapon arrived. Out of the surrounding country, drawn back by the sound and the signals of the fighting, came the Gothic and Allan cavalry of Alathius and Saphrax. The fighting ground on for hours, a continuous, exhausting massacre under the brutal sun, until the plain was carpeted with bodies, in places piled into mounds where men had fought and died on top of their fallen comrades. As the day finally cooled toward evening, the wounded who still lived lay pinned beneath the weight of the dead, crying out for water that would never come. Somewhere in that disintegrating mass was the Emperor Valens himself. He had ridden out that morning chasing a glory that he wanted to keep from his nephew, and now his army was dying around him. What happened to him in those final hours is one of the enduring mysteries of Roman history, because his body was never found. There are 2 stories. In one, Valens was struck down in the chaos of the field, killed by an arrow or in the press of bodies, his corpse stripped and lost among the thousands of others, never identified, never recovered. In the other, more haunting account, the wounded emperor was carried by a handful of loyal guards to a small farmhouse nearby, where they tried to tend to him and defend him. The Goths, pursuing the fleeing Romans, surrounded the building, and when they could not break in, they set it on fire. Only later, from a survivor who leaped from a window, did anyone realize that they had burned the emperor of the Eastern Roman world alive inside, never knowing the prize they had destroyed. Either way, Valens vanished from the earth. No tomb, no funeral, no body. The man who ruled half the Roman Empire simply ceased to exist on that battlefield. He did not die alone in his rank. The senior generals Sebastianus and Trajanus were killed. Around 35 officers of the rank of tribune fell. A few men of high standing managed to cut their way out and escape into the gathering dusk, carrying the news. But the leadership of the Eastern Roman military had been gutted in a single afternoon. When the killing finally stopped and an eerie quiet settled over the field, the surviving Romans fled into the woods and hills in small, terrified groups, while the Goths gave thanks for a victory greater than anything they could have imagined when they first begged to cross the river. The numbers tell the scale of it. By the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, with the ancient sources stating that roughly 2/3 of the entire army was destroyed. The contemporary historian who chronicled the battle compared it directly to Cannae, the legendary catastrophe centuries earlier when Hannibal had annihilated a Roman army in a single day. For a Roman, there was no darker comparison. Cannae was the byword for total disaster. To stand Adrianople beside it was to say that this was as bad as it had ever gotten. But the casualty figures, terrible as they are, do not capture why this battle echoes so loudly down the centuries. The deeper damage was strategic and psychological. An emperor had been killed in open battle against a foreign enemy on his own soil, something that had not happened in living memory. The Eastern Field Army, the instrument that protected the richest provinces of the empire, was wrecked, and the Balkans lay open and largely undefended. The Goths were now loose inside the empire, victorious, well armed with Roman equipment, and impossible to expel. They could not take the walled city of Adrianople itself, lacking the engines for a proper siege, and they failed against the great walls of Constantinople as well. but they did not need to capture cities to have changed everything. They had proven that the Roman military machine could be beaten decisively in a pitched battle, and that lesson could not be unlearned by anyone, Roman or barbarian. There is a long-running debate among historians about what Adrianople really meant for the art of war. For a long time, the standard story was that this was the day heavy cavalry overthrew the infantry, the moment the armored horseman replaced the foot soldier as the master of the battlefield, and that it pointed the way toward the mounted knights of the Middle Ages 1,000 years later. More careful study has complicated that picture. The Roman infantry was not beaten because foot soldiers were obsolete. It was beaten because it was exhausted, thirsty, badly handled, committed to an attack before it was ready, and then taken in the flank by a force it had never even known was on the field. The cavalry charge was decisive not because horsemen had become invincible, but because it struck a disordered army at the perfect moment. The moment Fritigern had patiently bought with his fires and his stalling and his endless requests for talks. The true lesson of Adrianople is less about a magic weapon and more about discipline, intelligence, patience, and the deadly cost of letting pride override caution. And yet the consequences were as vast as if the world had truly changed. The Eastern Empire needed a new emperor to replace the dead Valens, and the man chosen to take up that broken inheritance was a capable general named Theodosius, who would become known as Theodosius the Great. He spent years stabilizing the situation, and rather than driving the Goths out, which he simply could not do, he came to terms with them. In the year 382, a treaty settled the Goths inside the empire as allies, as foederati, permitted to live on Roman land under their own leaders in exchange for military service. It was a turning point. For the first time, a barbarian nation was settled inside the borders of the empire as a more or less autonomous body, not absorbed and dissolved into the Roman population, but kept intact, with its own identity and its own chiefs. That precedent, born from the inability to defeat the Goths after Adrianople, would be repeated and would help to transform the Western Empire over the following century into a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. The Goths who fought at Adrianople did not vanish into Roman society. Their descendants and successors remained a force inside and against the empire for generations. A little over 30 years after the battle, a Gothic king named Alaric would lead his people to the walls of Rome itself and sack the Eternal City, an event that sent a shock through the entire ancient world. The road that led to that sack, and to the slow collapse of Roman authority in the West, and the final end of the Western Empire in the year 476, can be traced back through a chain of causes and consequences to that hot afternoon outside Adrianople, when a jealous emperor marched out to win a victory he did not need to fight for, against an enemy he had badly miscounted. It is worth sitting for a moment with how avoidable it all was. If Valens had simply waited a few more days, Gratian and the Western army would have arrived, and two combined Roman forces would very likely have crushed the Goths. If the Roman scouts had ranged farther and found the foraging cavalry, Valens would have known the true strength of his enemy and might have stayed behind his fortifications. If the elite units on the right had held their discipline instead of charging without orders, the negotiations might have dragged on long enough for cooler heads to prevail, or the battle might have opened on Roman terms. If Valens had been willing to share the glory with his nephew, the empire would have kept its emperor and its army. Instead, a sequence of human failures, corruption at the river, cruelty toward the refugees, jealousy in the emperor's heart, complacency in the scouting, and indiscipline in the ranks, lined up one after another until they produced a catastrophe. The Goths were brave and well led, and Fritigern's patience was masterful. But Rome was not so much defeated as it defeated itself, and then was finished off by a force it never saw coming. The plain east of Adrianople is quiet farmland today, and you would never know, walking across it, that this unremarkable stretch of ground once held one of the great hinge points of Western history. But for one afternoon in the late summer of the 4th century, it was the place where the long invincibility of Rome was broken, where an emperor disappeared without a grave, and where a hidden column of cavalry came thundering out of the heat haze to change the fate of the ancient world. If you found yourself drawn into this story, the forgotten turning points of history are exactly what this channel exists to uncover. The battles and the decisions that shaped the world and then slipped out of the textbooks. Subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one finds you, because there are far stranger and more decisive moments still waiting to be told, and you are not going to want to miss where this story leads next.